Preparing leather for hand stitching requires some considerations. In this course I'll be teaching you how to calculate pricking iron sizes, the different styles in leathercraft, what pricking irons and stitching chisel sizes to use for certain projects and styles, what thread size to use for certain pricking iron and stitching chisel sizes, the different types of threads, what harness needles should you use for hand stitching, what I recommend for a beginner. I'll show you how to crease leather with a heated edge creaser, and also how to use pricking irons. Without further ado, let's begin this course. In the first course, I discussed pricking irons and stitching chisels. In short, pricking irons have a slight taper and is often but not always used with an awl. Stitching chisels have no taper and are designed to not need an awl. There are a range of stitch hole designs. The more common ones are straight, diamond, round or slanted holes. My personal preference is the slanted holes, also known as French style pricking irons. In fine leather goods, slanted holes are more commonly used as they are the traditional style pricking iron and can achieve nice angled stitching. When it comes to pricking iron and stitching chisel sizes, pricking irons and stitching chisels are sized in millimeters, stitches per inch, or teeth per inch. The millimeter measurement is the distance between one tooth to another. The stitches per inch, or SPI, is the total number of stitches made for 1 inch of measurement. The teeth per inch is the number of pricking iron teeth used for 1 inch of measurement. Certain countries prefer to use SPI or teeth per inch. The British, for example, prefer stitches per inch. This means the British 9 SPI pricking iron will be a European 10 pricking iron, because to make 9 stitches per inch, you need 10 stitch holes per inch. However, having 10 stitch holes per inch makes for 9 stitches per inch. Thankfully, the millimeter measurement is agreed upon, so you can check the millimeter measurement and either use the spaces per inch or teeth per inch. From my experience, suppliers generally have the millimeter measurement on pricking irons and stitching chisels, so it's not really a big deal. But just be cautious if you buy from an English supplier or another overseas supplier and they have a number on their pricking irons. However, most likely, there will be a millimeter measurement. I personally like to use the stitches per inch measurement as I find it easier to know how many stitches there will be per inch compared to the millimeter measurement. So when I refer to a number, it will be stitches per inch and not teeth per inch. The best size for a beginner, in my opinion, is a 2.82mm, 3mm or 3.175mm pricking iron or stitching chisel, essentially a 9, 8.4 or 8 SPI. Different brands of pricking irons or stitching chisels can have different millimeter measurements, and that can be confusing to know what size the pricking iron or stitching chisel is in stitches per inch. Here are 2 simple calculations you can do with pricking irons and stitching chisels. The first calculation is to find out what stitches per inch a pricking iron or stitching chisel is using its millimeter measurement. The second calculation is to find out what millimeter measurement a pricking iron is using its stitches per inch. Do not use this calculation to measure teeth per inch, as the results will show the next stitches per inch measurement. I'll also include a list of some of the different millimeter measurements that are available for pricking irons and stitching chisels. Just note, this doesn't mean every size on these tables is available for both pricking irons and stitching chisels. Stitching chisels, for example, tend to not go to the smaller sizes compared to pricking irons. These are sizes that I found available either in certain pricking irons and or stitching chisels. Sizes of pricking irons and stitching chisels will also vary depending on the supplier, hence the variety. I've also highlighted the most common sizes for both pricking irons and stitching chisels. I've also included the stitches per inch measurement next to the millimeter measurement. Different pricking iron and stitching chisel sizes are better used on certain projects. While you could technically use any size pricking iron or stitching chisel on any project, however there are some considerations. These considerations are the style, what the item is, and also the thickness of the item. The first consideration is the overall style of the leather goods you want to make. I would say there are 4 main styles of leather goods: fine leather goods, western leather goods, rustic leather goods, and social media leather goods. Each different style has its own set of unwritten rules. The style you want to choose from is completely up to you and your own taste. Most people today find Leathercraft on social media. This is one of the reasons why I recommend the 8 to 9 SPI pricking iron, because with that size you can tackle projects from watch straps, wallets, handbags to duffel bags. Start small, work on the basic techniques, and then as you go along you can go down the particular Leathercraft style avenue that you like. My style is a combination of fine leather goods and social media leather goods, either hand stitching or machine stitching. As you develop in your Leathercraft journey, you can use different size pricking irons or stitching chisels and different types and thicknesses of thread. In terms of the thickness of leather, you can technically use any size pricking iron or stitching chisel on any thickness. Each leather craftsman will differ with his or her recommendations, although if there is a will, there is a way. For example, a horse head collar in English leather goods would have areas that would be approximately 12mm thick and traditionally would be stitched at 8 SPI. A 9 SPI pricking iron would also be used on 9 to 10mm thick leather. I myself have made belts with a 9 SPI pricking iron with the help of reverse pricking irons, going through 9mm thick using an awl, and probably going past 10mm thick with the keeper with an awl. This is where an awl can come in handy. Of course, there are questions of if it would be practical to stitch 12 SPI on an extremely thick project, as a 12 SPI will be a lot of stitching, and if you are using an awl, you don't want the stitch holes to be made too wide open. You'd also need to use thinner thread. Certainly you wouldn't want to use thicker thread. Depending on the pricking iron or stitching chisel, you should match the thread appropriately. Stitching chisels tend not to be made in the higher SPIs, unlike pricking irons. In terms of using lower SPI sizes, such as a 5 SPI, this won't be aesthetically pleasing on wallets, watch straps, etc. in fine leather goods. However, in rustic leather goods, lower SPI sizes adds to the style. Lower SPIs do require thicker thread. If you use too thin thread, it won't look proportionate, and if you have large stitch holes, the thread will struggle to fill the stitch holes. So check the size of the stitch holes on your lower SPI pricking irons or stitching chisels. I've seen a watch strap use a 5 SPI stitching chisel with 0.6mm thread, which is a medium to thick thread, and that worked. I would recommend to test the different thread sizes to see what you prefer, whether you are using lower or higher SPI pricking irons or stitching chisels. Bear in mind the particular style of leathercraft you like, whether that's more rustic leather goods with large space stitch holes with larger thread, or more fine leather goods with smaller space stitch holes with smaller thread, depending on the project. For example, except in the case of projects like attaché cases, luggage, etc. So whatever leather goods style you like, go with that. With all that said, here is a guide of pricking irons and stitching chisel sizes to use for your projects. In terms of what pricking iron brands you can choose from, the pricking irons I use are from our English brand, Abbey England. There are some other brands that are trusted in the leathercraft community, although I don't have any experience using them. Once you have chosen your pricking irons or stitching chisels, it needs to match the thread size. Thread size for hand stitching is measured by thread diameter in millimeters, as opposed to machine stitching that uses ticket, text size or metric to size thread. This is covered in more detail in the course on machine stitching. With thread size, you don't want to match a smaller size pricking iron, for example 10 spaces per inch, to a larger 1mm thread, as again this will not be proportionate. Here is a thread guide to pricking iron guide. Use this table as a guide for hand stitching. This guide is not meant for machine stitching, as machine stitching thread size and needle size is different. There are 4 common types of threads used in leathercraft: linen, polyester, nylon and cotton. Linen is more traditional, and being a natural fibre, it requires being waxed with beeswax. Linen thread can often already come slightly waxed, but it's best to still wax the thread. This gives the thread some coating, allowing it to be more resistant to moisture and makes it more durable compared to if it was left unwaxed. Linen thread sits very well on leather and looks very refined. When the thread is hammered down, the thread has a very nice appearance. If you like the more traditional look, go with linen. Linen has good abrasion resistance. Linen thread is cabled with flax fibres, and the flax fibres have certain lengths to them. This means the thread is spliced together to make a long length of thread, whereas polyester and nylon thread is one continuous length. With linen thread you might get a large node where the thread has been spliced together when you uncoil the thread. Most times the splice isn't very noticeable, although if you get a large node you won't be able to avoid this when hand stitching. You can continue stitching as usual, and the node will either go into a stitch hole or lay in between 2 stitch holes. It is noticeable if you do get a larger node that lays in between two stitch holes, but it's a potential result when having to stitch with linen. Linen thread is more prone to fraying with time, so be sure the thread is waxed well before hand stitching. Being a natural material, polyester and nylon will outlast linen and be better with long-term weather and environment exposure. Linen thread can rot if constantly damp. Linen thread can also twist up when stitching long lengths. To solve this, simply let the threads hang off the bench and the threads will untwist themselves and then begin hand stitching again. Linen shouldn't be used in a sewing machine as it requires being waxed to prevent fraying, and using linen thread waxed with beeswax in a sewing machine can risk the wax building up in the tension discs and other areas. Using unwaxed linen thread in a sewing machine won't be as durable compared to polyester and nylon thread, as this will be more prone to fraying with time and not be as resistant to moisture because it's not waxed with beeswax. Polyester and nylon thread don't require being waxed with beeswax. You can still wax these threads if you like if you are hand stitching. Hand stitching with polyester feels smooth and the thread glides through the stitch holes very easily. Polyester and nylon thread have the benefit of being used in both hand stitching and machine stitching, unlike linen. As mentioned before, polyester and nylon thread is one continuous length compared to linen. Polyester thread is more UV resistant compared to nylon thread. There are bonded nylon and bonded polyester threads. Bonded threads are coated with a polymer or resin to prevent the threads untwisting during sewing. This allows the thread to move more smoothly with minimal friction when using a sewing machine, especially at high speeds, also preventing the thread from snagging and breaking compared to non-bonded thread. The polymer or resin coating also improves abrasion resistance, gives a uniform finish to the thread, protects the thread from fading with UV exposure, damage from other chemicals, and also mildew resistance. The coating doesn't add any further strength to the thread, it just allows for less problems when sewing and better long-term durability across both weather and environment exposure. I cover machine stitching in more detail. In regards to cotton thread, you want to avoid using it, as cotton thread can be more prone to crumbling and breaking with different factors. Cotton will absorb liquids, and in the case of oil, cotton will absorb oil, and this can lubricate the fibers, causing them to lose friction and break. Oil also interferes with cotton's ability to absorb moisture. Over time, this can result in degradation of the fibers depending on the oil. With water exposure, cotton absorbs water and will swell, becoming stronger. Cotton doesn't have good abrasion resistance, especially if the thread is exposed on the leather surface. Abrasion could risk the stitches breaking. Sweat can also potentially rot the fibers. This of course will vary from person to person. Different tannins in the leather could also possibly affect the threads. Finally, the thread dye color. If the cotton was repeatedly dyed, such as in the color black, it could weaken the thread. There is either twisted or cabled thread, or braided thread. Cabled threads is where the fibers are individually twisted into strands. Cable thread has a rounded look and looks more natural compared to braided threads. You can get cabled threads in linen, polyester, and nylon. Braided threads are of course braided, just imagine how hair can be braided. You can have either a round braided thread or a flat braided thread like tiger thread. Braided threads tend to be polyester thread. Both cabled and braided threads are good for leather crafters. I prefer cabled thread as it looks more natural and is more traditional, and I personally don't like the look of braided thread. That is of course personal preference. In terms of strength, both cabled and braided threads are strong and durable for any leather project. If an award had to go to one, it would be braided thread because of the braiding process. Ritz the tiger thread is a braided polyester thread and would be the strongest thread in leathercraft. It has apparently 18 tiny interwoven strands, is lightly waxed and UV resistant. The thread is flat, and after hammering the thread down, the thread will lay flat on leather. This gives a slightly different look to cabled thread, and again it's personal preference if you like the thread or not. I personally prefer cabled thread, especially in linen, as I like the more traditional look on projects. However, if I was making items for customers or a project such as a bag, where it is exposed to the elements, I would choose a cabled polyester thread for its longevity. Just be sure to stay away from cotton threads. Choosing harness needles is much more simpler. You want to use blunted needles. The Saddler harness needles by the brand John James are blunted needles that are strong, durable, and are able to last for years. Here is a guide for harness needles to thread size. I use size 4. I recommend for a beginner 2.82mm, 3mm or 3.175mm pricking irons or stitching chisels, 0.5 to 0.6 cabled thread in either linen or polyester, size 4 John James Saddler harness needles, and some beeswax. Now I'll teach you how to prepare leather for stitching. We have our pieces of leather that we bonded together in the previous course. Now this totals about approximately 2.7mm thick. Now as you can see, the edges aren't completely flush. and also there's some slight excess adhesive on the leather edges. In regards to the edges not being flush, this can be down to mainly human error. You could have simply cut out the template on a slight angle. You could have cut the template out with 0.5 millimeter wider on one side, and then by the time you cut out some leather, bond it together, you have edges that don't line up. Another reason is you simply could have just not lined up the edges when you were bonding them together. In any case, what you would need to do is either sand the leather edges before stitching, or once you've stitched the leather together, sand the edges to get them nice and flush. In regards to the second option, if you've stitched this together, what will happen is that you'll be sanding this side down before this other side gets sanded. This means that the stitches are going to be closer to the edge on this side as opposed to this side. So when your leather does not line up together, it can be kind of annoying. To avoid all of this, we are going to trim 4 millimeters off each of the edges, and this is called trim allowance. Trim allowance is excess that is purposely put into the pattern to be removed once the pieces are bonded together. Removing the excess will bring the project back to its original measurement if there was no trim allowance, with smooth flush edges. This gives accurate stitch holes on both sides, with the stitch holes being the same length from the edge. Trim allowance prevents having to sand unaligned leather back. There are going to be projects where you can't do trim allowance. For example, bonding a bag main panel to the gusset. But it's best to try and implement trim allowance if you can. The reason I do 4 millimeters because I find it a good width and it's good enough to remove any large unaligned edges compared to a smaller trim allowance. I remove the edges using 2 rulers. If you don't have 2 rulers, what you can use instead is the leather template trim allowance. However, you will need 1 ruler for this. So what we'll do is we'll remove the trim allowance on both templates, and I'll show you both these techniques and you can decide which one you want to use. The first way we're going to do is using these 2 rulers. Now as you can see, this side here on the bottom doesn't line up. However, what we're going to do is when we line up the rulers, we're just going to focus on the top line. So even if the bottom is sticking out a bit, that's completely fine. We're not going to worry about this measurement. We're simply going to worry about this top measurement for the rulers. So then get the ruler and we're going to line it up along this line here. Get this little ruler here and we're going to line it up 4 millimeters from the edge. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the line on the top leather. Once we've lined up 4 millimeters, you can either mark it with an awl or you can just get your utility knife. And using the same techniques that I taught in course 2, light score mark. We'll do another score mark, but cut a bit further deep. And then slowly go through the leather. And we'll work our way around the rectangle. The second technique is using this template here. And again, we're going to focus on this top leather line here. If you can see any underneath uneven leather, don't worry about it. Focus on this top leather line. Line up 4 millimeters. Get your awl blade and just mark it. We'll move around again. It's definitely better to use the larger size ruler compared to this little one. And now you should have flush edges. Before we start using our pricking irons or stitching chisels, we need to make a stitch line so that we can follow it along with our pricking iron or stitching chisel to make sure our stitch holes are straight. There are two options. The first option is a wing divider. You can set this to 4mm and then simply just mark the leather and then follow it along with your pricking iron or stitching chisel. The second option, and this is my preferred option, is using an edge creaser. This is a 1.5mm size. An edge creaser marks a decorative line. This gives a nice appearance and is often associated with fine leather work. The process also compresses the fibers along the edge, and this reduces the water absorption into the edge. You can use this decorative crease line to mark a stitch line about 1mm from the crease line. Edge creases can also be heated up to give a more defined decorative crease, and this makes it easier to make a crease line, especially over textured leathers. So you can use either a wing divider or an edge creaser. For this purpose, I'm going to use an edge creaser, and I'm going to show you how to heat one up and use it. Of course, this is optional. If you don't feel comfortable or safe heating up an edge creaser, you don't have to. Once the crease line is marked, we'll move on to making the stitch holes with a pricking iron. To heat up your edge creaser, you can use a flame. I'll be using a candle. You can buy alcohol burners, but I find a candle to be more controllable. With any open flame, it's important to be careful. Here I have the 1.5mm edge creaser, a folded paper towel. This will remove any soot if any gets on the edge creaser, and a little piece of leather in the same color that I'm creasing. There are two things to know. When heating up an edge creaser, it will take a little bit to heat up. When it's heated and taken off the flame, it will start to lose heat immediately. However, it will be easier to reheat the edge creaser as it's already warmed as opposed to when it's cold. The second thing is you don't want to burn the leather. Natural vegetable tan leather is more obvious to see if an edge creaser has burned the leather, as the crease will be brown from burning the leather. With all that said, let's begin. We want to make sure that the edge creaser is completely clean. And as you can see, we have our candle, and we're simply going to place the edge creaser over the top of the candle. We're not going to have it touching the flame at all, because if we touch the flame with the edge creaser, it will start to blacken and you'll get soot on your edge creaser. So just have it above the flame. Depending on the candle that you use, it will depend on how you hold the edge creaser against the flame. What I like to do now, and this is optional of course, I don't recommend doing this on an alcohol burner, but what I do is I get my finger and place it just on that 1.5. And I'll notice is that once my finger gets warm, the edge creaser is heated up. Here, it feels quite warm. So what I'll do is I'll just test the edge creaser. And that looks pretty good. And this would be pretty much ready to use. And if you don't want to place your finger here, simply just have it over the flame and then just wait a bit. And then you can just take it off the flame simply and then just try it out. And you can tell if the crease line's good because it'll be quite well defined. And if there's no burning at all, then it's ready to use. And to reheat the edge creaser, it only needs about 5 seconds over the flame and it's ready to go again. And we're going to crease both sides. So I'll just place this over the top. Make sure there's no soot at all. Just quickly double check. And we'll start to crease. And you're just applying a nice firm pressure to make that decorative crease line. And you'll notice when it starts to lose heat, it tends to not leave as a defined crease mark as opposed to when you first did it. Just put it over the flame again. Not very long. You can just go back around just as a final crease. And what we'll do is we'll flip this over and do it on the opposite side. And what you should have is a nice decorative crease line. And we'll do the exact same to this piece. Now we're on to marking the stitch holes. You'll need a pricking iron or stitching chisel, a surface to protect your pricking iron teeth, and a rubber or nylon hammer. The first step you want to make sure is that you're on a flat surface, because you don't want this to be on an uneven surface, you want it to be on a flat surface. We're going to get the pricking iron. So we want to make sure the pricking iron tooth is 1 millimeter in from this crease line here, and also 1 millimeter from this crease line. And we want the pricking iron to be directly straight. We don't want it to be angled either side, we want it to be directly straight. The next thing you want to do is get your pinky and place it on the leather, because what that will do is it will keep the leather flat and it will prevent the leather from going up when you hit the pricking iron on the edge. So hold the pricking iron directly straight. Get your rubber or nylon hammer. You want to strike the top of the pricking iron, not on the side, as you want the pricking iron to go straight down through to the opposite side and not be angled, as the other side will come out angled and be either closer or further away from the edge compared to the front side. Now that you're on a flat surface, your pricking iron is about 1 millimeter from the crease line, or on the line in the case of a wing divider. The pricking iron is straight and not angled, and you're aiming to hit the top of the pricking iron. You're now ready to hit the pricking iron. The first hit we're going to do is going to be a light hit. This allows the pricking iron teeth to sink slightly into the leather. We're aiming for accuracy on the first hit, that the pricking iron is straight and that the pricking iron didn't go on an angle. If we do a hard hit on the first go, the force of the hit could potentially angle the teeth going through. Then we'll hit again with more force and then aim to go through the leather. You can do another firm hit if you like, depending on the thickness of leather. Depending on the thickness of leather, you might need 2 lighter hits before the firm hit, or 1 lighter hit before a firm hit. The first hit we're going to do is going to be a simple light hit, and then the next hit is going to have a bit more pressure, and we're aiming to go through on the second hit. And see, we've penetrated through, and we'll do one more. The next thing we're going to do is use these holes to maintain a straight line. Now notice that if you go into the last hole, there is a lot of wiggle room, and it's quite easy to angle off. And the further back you go, the less wiggle room there is, and the more likely it is to stay in a straight line. Whereas on the last hole, there is a lot of wiggle room. So my preference is about the second hole. Third hole has a lot less. And again. And now just follow along that line. When you get to the end, you just want to make sure that this tooth here stays inside that crease line. So even if you have to go further back, that's fine, but you don't want to have that tooth going over the crease line. Same again. You should have one with stitch holes. The other one should be left plain because we'll be using this for another course. That's it for this course. If you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me through email or social media. Be sure to enjoy your leather crafting.